It's exciting when your baby is finally ready to start trying solid foods, but it can also feel overwhelming. How do you know your baby is ready? What foods should you introduce first? What if they don't like solid foods? And, what about food allergies? Here are some tips for how to start your baby on solid foods. When should my baby start solid foods? The American Academy of Pediatrics, WHO, and Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics recommend starting solids at about 6 months of age. This is the age when babies are showing developmental signs of readiness for solid foods. However, some sources suggest it's possible to try introducing solid foods earlier than that. Boston Children's Hospital states that generally when infants double their birth weight, typically at about 4 months of age, and weigh about 13 pounds or more, they may be ready for solid foods. How do I know my baby is ready for solid foods? There are key developmental signs to look for that will indicate whether your baby is ready for solid foods. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, these developmental steps include adequate control of their head and neck, ability to sit up alone or with some support, can swallow food instead of pushing it back out, moves food from the front of the tongue to the back in order to swallow, opens their mouth when food is offered, brings objects to their mouth, tries to grab small objects. How do I start my baby on solid foods? As you start your baby on solid foods, you can expect them to eat as little as 1 tablespoon or even just a few bites. They'll still be getting the majority of their food from either breast milk or formula. The balance between formula or breast milk and solid foods will start to shift as your baby gets older. At 6 months they might be eating 1 or 2 portions a day, and then by 12 months, the baby is probably eating solid food closer to 3 to 5 times a day. The importance of repeated exposure. When you're introducing foods that might not be sweet or salty, such as green leafy vegetables, repeated exposure is important. You probably would see the baby at the first exposure, or the first few exposures, just play with it, put it in their mouth then spit it out, drop it on the floor and pick it up again or play with it in their hands. This is a normal reaction and for caregivers to be persistent and keep offering it to them. What food should I feed my baby first? Foods to initially feed your baby include infant cereals and purees made with vegetables, fruits, or meats. Or tender cooked finger foods from the family table for self-feeding or a combination of both. Although finger foods are not recommended until babies are about 6 months and showing developmental signs of readiness. 2 foods that you should not introduce to your baby before 12 months are honey, as it could cause infant botulism, and cow's milk, as a beverage, although small amounts in recipes are fine. Because a baby should still be taking human milk or formula to get the proper nutrients. Take care to avoid even products that simply contain honey, such as cereals or crackers that have honey in them. How do I feed my baby solid foods? Even within the same family, any parent who has more than 1 child will say that every child is very different. So it's hard to make a blanket recommendation. For parents who are looking for some general guidelines, the Children's Hospital Colorado recommends introducing spoon feeding for babies between the ages of 4 and 6 months and for the caregiver to feed the baby. Gagging is a common, noisy part of the process of learning to eat. If, when feeding your baby, you notice them begin to gag, splutter, or cough, it's best to stay calm and coach the baby to chew and swallow the food on their own. Choking is when a piece of food blocks the child's airway and requires intervention. How do I know if my baby has an allergy to a new food? Hives and vomiting are the most common signs that your baby may be having an allergic reaction to a new food. Shortness of breath, coughing, or wheezing could also occur, though older children are more likely than babies to display these symptoms. Oral allergy syndrome is another reaction to watch for. This syndrome can cause an itchy sensation in the mouth but is not necessarily dangerous to the child. However, it's important to introduce highly allergenic foods early on, starting at around 4 to 6 months. Previously, it was suggested to wait until a child was at least a year old to introduce this group of foods. New research has since shown this delay increases a child's risk of developing allergies. Some of the most highly allergenic foods and food groups include cow's milk, soy, eggs, wheat, tree nuts, peanuts, shellfish, fish, and sesame. It is helpful to introduce the top 9 allergens one at a time, either standalone or with foods the baby has had and tolerated before. This way, if there is a reaction, it's easier to determine which food is responsible. It's also important to introduce an appropriate amount of the allergen at a high enough frequency to determine a baby's tolerance to it. You should provide a child with at least 2 grams per allergen per week to have it be effective when introducing something like peanut butter, for example. It's suggested that a child should be served this quantity at least 3 times a week to ensure adequate exposure.